welcome to this segment of the series Your Arlington Dollar. I'm James Milan, and I am joined once again by Walter Fye, certified public accountant and former member of the Finance Committee, and Annie LaCourt, who is a software engineer, but also importantly a former selectman and a current town meeting member. Walter and Annie, thanks for coming in again.
You're welcome.
Today's topic is going to be the long-term financial plan for Arlington and what its impact is on decision making. And we talked in an earlier conversation in this series with Town Manager Adam Chapdelaine about the financial plan upon its release a short while ago. And I just wanted to quote one thing from the introduction to the financial plan, which says that it is a document that is essentially a collection, much more than simply being a collection of numbers. It is a reflection of our community's values, priorities, and goals. That is something that our panelists here have reiterated in the past, and I'm sure that we will see just how closely tied in the financial plan is to our community values, et cetera. So to get a grounding in what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to ask Annie to provide basically just the context, tell us what the financial plan, the long-term financial plan is, what the components are, what it is intended to do, et cetera.
Our long-term financial plan is essentially a financial projection that rolls forward 5 years. So we're always looking 5 years ahead in terms of the growth in spending and our income projections and so on and so forth. So the 5-year plan is managed, I shouldn't say managed, reviewed by a committee that I started when I was on the Board of Selectmen called the Long-Term Planning Committee that has representatives from the school committee, the Board of Selectmen, the treasurer, town manager, finance committee members, all the sort of constituents sit on that committee, and they actually look at what do we see coming down the pike that we should make sure is reflected in our financial projections? Things like an override to rebuild the high school, so on and so forth. What's going to affect us? And the original plan was developed by Charlie Lyons in his last year on the Board of Selectmen, and he presented that in conjunction with a request for then a long-term override. And what he saw the plan as is making a promise to the citizens of Arlington about what we would do to control the growth of spending. And so the plan contains a lot of caps on our rate of spending. There's in the current plan, it's a 3% cap on the growth in town department spending, 3.5% cap on the growth in general education spending in the schools. It's a 7% cap on the growth in special education costs. I want to say we've reduced the growth in the healthcare costs to something like 5.5%, and then 6% growth on our pensions, which is the minimum growth we can do to meet state law. And so we apply all those parameters to our current spending, and we project forward. And then as our current spending changes, those projections get reprojected year over year. And in fact, the 3% growth rate that we're applying to this year's budget is down from the 3.5% rate we've applied to the last 3 years of budgets.
Okay.
And so essentially when we ask for an operating override, we present this plan and we say, here are the parameters we're going to live within, and these are the services that this override will preserve for you, vote it up or down, and then we live by that commitment. So one of the important consensuses we've built in town around that 5-year plan is that once the voters have passed an override and said, okay, we agree with your plan, we stick to it no matter what. So although the schools are allowed to spend up to 7% more on special education year over year, they, if their costs rise more than that, they have to make cuts or take money from some other part of their budget to stay within that cap. And the same thing is true for all the other parameters. So that, you know, if, for example, our healthcare costs in this year rose more than that cap, we'd have to cut other budgets to stay within the parameters.
Okay, and I just also wanted to get out on the table that this is having a 5-year projected forward financial plan for a town is relatively unusual in the experience that you've
Yes.
had in
Yes.
looking at Massachusetts.
I think for bigger cities and towns, that this is not so unusual, but as I've been talking to other cities and towns about adopting visual budget, many of them do not have a 5-year projection to give me to put into their visual budget. Many of them don't have even a 1-year projection that they want to put in.
Okay, so this certainly seems like a very useful device for us to have. And Walter, one of the things I heard in Annie's description is that it is setting out kind of caps on how much money can be spent in this number of areas. Nonetheless, I suspect that perhaps you may have issues with the financial plan and its implications or its effects on our decision making.
Well, as a taxpayer, I look at the financial plan, and the thing that kind of jumps out at me is the costs just keep going up. And so my interest would be to have and so what's going to happen is 5 years from now, or whenever that point is, the town is going to request an override of the citizens, and that's going to be for some set amount of money. What I'm encouraging is that there be a sharing of the burden of providing that override between increased taxation on the part of the property owners and the government itself contributing some part of that total amount of funds that are needed to fund the government from within its own infrastructure, through whether it's increased efficiencies, allocation of resources, but to share the burden between just the taxpayer and the other people involved in government.
Okay, so just before Annie responds, let me just make sure I understand that, in a sense, you may have a problem with the financial plan as it exists because, as you say, that money just keeps going up. And therefore, it's going to be perpetuating this cycle that you find problematic of continuing.
Well, I find it problematic because not only does it go up, continue to go up, but what happens is that the override, the taxpayer bears the full brunt of the override. And it's maybe not the most competitive thing to encourage competitiveness, or to encourage the government looking within itself to find out where can it be more efficient, where can it find savings, what services that we provide are the most efficient and the most sought after, as a way of kind of weaning itself from to generate cost savings.
Annie, I suspect you have a response.
I have some very strong responses to that particular perspective. So the first question that I have about that is, why is there always an assumption that somehow government is not already looking for these efficiencies? These caps don't allow our departments to say, oh, we want to do these 5 things this year, and here's how much money it's going to cost, and then for us to just arbitrarily provide that money without any consideration of sort of cost-benefit analysis or going back or understanding what the trade-offs are. All of our department heads have to make those trade-offs year over year. They have to choose between the services they're providing now and new needs that require a shift in how they're spending their resources, and they have to figure out whether or not they can continue to support the levels of their personnel based on the rise in those costs. 80% of our budget is personnel. If we say we're not raising our costs for our personnel, that means nobody gets a raise, nobody can have an increase in the cost of their pension, nobody can have an increase in the cost of their health insurance premiums.
Well,
literally,
right.
Let me finish. Literally, you would have to cut people's salaries in a year when health insurance premiums went up to level fund the budget, or you have to cut personnel, and in the past that's what we've done. So the first question is, why is that there at that assumption? And then my second question is about this whole business of the idea of shared pain. When we hold an override and we vote to increase our taxes so that we will continue to provide the same services that we're receiving right now, okay, we don't share the burden with our employees. Our employees take the whole burden. Their salaries are restricted in how much they can rise. They see their companions laid off in order for us to meet these spending caps. They have to do the same work with less resources. They have to be more efficient, more productive, and they have to do that regardless of whether or not anybody has actually thought about whether or not that's possible.
I think
So-
that number of employees in the town is generally rising as it's been over the last several years. So I don't think that there's a big layoff issue right now in the town. One of the concerns that I have is that with the level of spending that we do, and we've funded all these positions, you know,
Yep.
fundamentally this budget represents staff in town,
Yep.
whether it's a teacher, a firefighter, a policeman, a clerk, whomever.
Yeah, as Annie mentioned, 80%, right?
Right,
80% of the budget is
80% of the
personnel.
budget. And so we're reliant on other governments to help, to give us money so that we can fund these
That being
positions that we
state,
have in the
federal
town.
government.
It means we get, you know, 13% of our revenue from the state. The state gets 26% of its revenue from the federal government. So, and there's a lot of pressure on the federal government being able to continue at the level of spending that they're at, given the amount of debt that the government continues to take on. Basically, all from my perspective, all the level of governments from the local to the state to the federal, it all rests with the big daddy federal government up there, and he's the one that's generating, borrowing all the dough, right? Everybody else has to balance their budgets, but those chickens are going to come home to roost. We're putting the burden of paying for that debt, and luckily interest rates are very cheap right now, but as they may rise, as they do over time, up or down, the burden of paying for that debt is going to be on the shoulders of our children and people coming after us. And I submit that that's not a sustainable way to budget ourselves, to spend our money here relying on that problem. We're just putting it off into the future.
So are you advocating, Walter, then for us to do whatever we need to do as a town in order to be able to reduce our dependence on the support of the state and the federal government?
And be prepared. Be prepared. You know, I don't imagine, and you might be able to speak to this, in terms of when the state funding took a hit. I think it was it 2003,
Yes.
the first time. I mean, we've had a couple of recessions in there, but the amount of money that the town got from the state got reduced dramatically. And so we had to look at where we were spending our money and, you know, say, okay, this is the most important thing to us. And that's what I'm advocating, that we kind of have a process that's legislated, if you will, that encourages the town to continue to do that even in the good times.
Right. And again, as I said, I think the town does that even in the good times, because even though we have good times right now, in some sense, the town has set these spending limits for itself. So, for example, if you look at the year 2011, we passed an override that was supposed to last for 3 years. It was like a $9 million override, okay, big chunk of money. And everybody's taxes went up $100, $150 a year, something like that. So immediately after we took that vote, the state gave us a tool to allow us to require our employees to change from their current then bargained health plans to go into the state plan, the GIC. And we negotiated with our employees a transfer into the GIC, and we got there. We saved $3 million a year on that negotiation. All of that money has been put in the bank in order to delay the next override. So our employees Our employees saw the cost of their health care go up. They lost their bargaining rights, okay? And they did not get a half of that money in their pay envelopes, okay? We were able to settle some contracts. We settled those contracts at somewhere south of 3% a year in terms of increases, okay? We didn't share that money with them. All of the reduction in pain that money bought has gone to the taxpayer.
Well, except insofar as town employees are also taxpayers, there is.
And it helps to fund.
Right, I understand.
They're not necessarily taxpayers in
those
this town.
those savings that we generate from the health insurance that money is available to negotiate pay increases. You know, so to say it doesn't, it's not going in
Except
back
it's
to the
not
employee.
available to negotiate those pay increases because we have a cap on spending. So we have to stay under those caps on spending.
Right.
You can't say,
But
oh,
a pay increase is included in that, within that
yes,
cap.
absolutely, it's included in those, but it still limits the size of those pay increases.
Mm-hmm.
The employees can't say, okay, we'll trade you this huge savings that benefits the taxpayer on our health insurance for a 5% raise. That's not what we negotiated with.
And if there was a mechanism, and I don't even know if this exists or whatever, but if there's a mechanism that says if the school committee wants to pay teachers, the higher performing teachers, more than 2%, more than a cost of living increase, is there a mechanism that they can, within their own purview of how many teachers they have, how much they're spending for each teacher, can they say, you know what, we're going to shift, we're going to reduce a staff person so we can give somebody a 10% raise, but we're going to still stay within that 2.5%, and maybe get some efficiency there.
So there's a couple of assumptions in there as well. The first assumption is that if you pay people more, they will be more efficient.
No,
Okay.
I did not assume that. I'm saying rewarding efficiency.
Okay.
I'm saying you see
So
somebody who's...
when it comes to teaching, what is your definition of efficiency, and how do you tell what the effect of a teacher is on one particular student's performance?
Right. That's
So
where the
I
pros
think
come in.
that even in private companies, usually the way that kind of productivity bonus is spread around is based on group effort. If the whole team meets their goal, then the whole team gets an increase in their pay. Well, our team, in terms of education, for the dollars that we spend, if you look in the superintendent's budget this year, you will see that for the dollars that we spend compared to the 12 communities we compare ourselves to, we spend way less money than most of those communities. We are below the average, okay? But our MCAS performance is way above the average. So the way to reward all the people who contributed to that is to give our entire education staff a bigger raise. But in order to do that, we have to spend more money than is involved in this plan.
So this is a big plan, right? So
Yep.
this is managed by the town manager and the school department, and this is a $140 million plan.
Yep.
If we as a town, and as the professionals who run the town think the school department is underpaid, then
Yep.
they can choose to allocate more resources to that school department to reward those teachers who are performing. Now, something's got to give. If we give another $5 million to the school department and we try to hold spending level, or even within 2.5%, increase every year, what's got to give? And so that's what I'm advocating for. I'm advocating for the professionals who run this. That's their purview. If education is more important, on balance, dedicate more resources to it, but within the framework of what we have, and find some way, find the less efficient assets, whether they're staff, whether they're buildings, whether they're whatever, and utilize those underutilized resources.
And that's what the 5-year plan does.
Yeah, and in a sense, it sounds like what you're saying, Walter, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you would like to establish a cap or to continue to adhere to caps and make the town's government make the choices that need to be made in order to provide, to reflect the values of the community, to reward and incentivize behavior or professional production such as we want it, but all within a finite pie that they're having to make those decisions around.
Yes,
Is that correct?
I'm not advocating, I'm not saying $140 million cap. I'm not. What I'm saying is that whatever the level of spending that we decide on as a town, that we share how we fund that level of spending between raising taxes and between allocation of resources within what we already have.
So I've got a couple of thoughts about this. Okay, so my first thought is, all right, that nowhere in there do we allow for the idea that we can evaluate the services we're receiving and decide that we want to spend money on more services or an increase in services or a refinement of services. And in fact, one of my problems with the 5-year plan all along has been that it's like a box. And we worry a lot about the edges of the box and the size of the box, but we don't talk a lot about what's inside the box and whether or not what's inside the box is actually what we want.
Right.
Neither in terms of not having services that we may not want, but also not in terms of increasing services that may be important to us. Nobody's even talking about imagining what it is that the mix of services is that we would want, okay? And then the second problem that I have with that argument is the idea that somehow our employees owe it to us to provide those same set of services for less money. And that's what the implication of this idea of shared pain is. They take all the pain, we don't share it. We're getting the same services for less cost
No, we're
than we
paying
did.
more. We're paying more.
We're getting the same services, okay, for less cost in terms of the growth in the budget. All of our employees are working harder than they were 10 years ago. Look, in 2003, we had 407 employees, and now we have 353.
So the fact that there are fewer
Right.
of them and they're providing
not
the same
necessarily-
level of service
Well,
would
they're not
imply.
necessarily providing the same level of service because at 407 employees, they had a certain amount of output that they created. Now, are that 350 employees that are left producing that same level of output? I doubt it. That would be, they may be. I'm not saying that it's not true, but probably what's happened is the amount of services the town is producing overall has declined somewhat. I would argue that it hasn't been a horror show. You know, things have, as a taxpayer looking around town, things are operating, you know, the schools are going, the roads are getting clean, the trash is getting picked up, you know. And so are we at the optimal? Are we at the optimal of what we can, how efficiently we can run as a government right now? Maybe we are. But so from this point forward, I'm saying, okay, if we want more, then let's work on it. Let's get it together. Don't just come to us, the taxpayers, saying, okay, now it's 5 years later, we need another 10 million. Bring something to the table. What do you got to trade?
We never come to the citizens and say, it's been 5 years, we need another $10 million. We come to the citizens and say, okay, if you give us another $10 million, you will continue to receive the services you're receiving. If you don't want those services, here's the list of things we'll cut.
Right, right.
The citizens always have the option to vote for the cuts.
Right.
They don't. They never have. Over and over and over again, the citizens of Arlington vote to preserve services. The assumption here, there's like a frame, if you want to look at this from a national macro level, there's a frame that we have all bought, which is the idea that government is inefficient and our taxes are a burden on us. They are not a burden on us. They are the price that we pay for the services that we decide we want collectively. And we get, at least in the town of Arlington, relative to our property taxes, we get an incredible deal. Okay? On a $6,000 tax bill this year, all that snow removal in March and February, $100. It's going to be a $100 bill.
I'll get back to my point of government isn't, from my perspective, government isn't encouraged, or maybe can be encouraged in different ways, to be self-reflective on, okay, you know, in private industry, you have to make a profit, right? In government, you have to have money to spend. And so by the nature of an organism, whether it's a government or whether it's a private company, it wants to grow. It wants to thrive, it wants to survive. And so I look at our government as I look at government in general, and I think it wants to grow. And so to me, I think, okay, the government wants to be bigger, it wants to do more things. I don't necessarily want it to do more things. I'd rather that through the power of how much taxes are being raised, to put more of that resource in the hands of the people of the town, the people of the state, and let them make their decisions on how. I think that's that can be a more efficient way of utilizing those resources. So my perspective here is, how can we encourage the town through looking at itself to just maintain and not to just keep growing and growing and being a bigger and bigger burden and raising property values and taxes.
Right. So you would like us to have a way to assess just how lean we can be as a government in a way that still reflects the values and priorities of the community, still provides the services, the level of services that are at least satisfactory to everybody, and have that government be constantly vigilant, be either made by external mechanisms or by the culture within or some combination thereof, to be constantly vigilant to stay at that level of as close to wholly balanced between how little money is required to provide all those services. Is that?
Yeah. What about this for a question? Like the next time the override comes up, right? So let's say it's going to be 2020 and it looks like it's $10 million or whatever it is. How about two questions on the ballot? One, would you vote for this override of $10 million and continue to fund basic according to the financial plan? Or would you vote for an override of $5 million with the government either making do with the $5 million or finding efficiencies so that they can have that amount of resource of $10 million available to them to go forward?
But you're assuming that there's $5 million worth of efficiencies to be found. No, let me finish my argument here. Okay, so if in that question, okay, and we can do that, it's called a menu override, and we can say, here's 10 pieces and you can vote for the ones that you want, okay? That still says there's a set of services you're now receiving and you get to choose which ones we're gonna cut. But that's not what I hear you saying. What I hear you saying is same set of services for $5 million less.
No, okay, so maybe I misspoke. I don't know what the exact right level of services is. I think I'd be on a $140 million budget.
Right.
I think I could live with $1 million less of that. Now, where that cuts, where the pros say, okay, we only have 139 million. I could live with that as a taxpayer.
Right.
So having that choice to me is valuable.
Right. But you have to make the choice. You can't, because what we're talking about isn't just give us the same services, the ones we all expect, for less money. You're talking about cutting some services. That's not a decision the professionals can make. We're the consumers. We have to say what it is we can live without. So it comes back to the same question. Which part of this budget do you want to cut? What do you want to live without? If you can identify $1 million worth of cuts out of this book, great. We can advocate for those. But you, the taxpayer, and this is true for every taxpayer, you have to say what it is you can live without. It's not a question of saying, shouldn't we be able to get this level of service for less money? That is not possible.
So this is what I think is, one of the things that's interesting about is, what level of service do we want as taxpayers, as citizens? You take 40,000 citizens, 20,000 whatever, voters, and I have my services that I like, and it's important for the town to provide, and everybody else has theirs. And put them all together, and here's what we got. And but I would argue that your level, you want more services. You want the town to provide more services. I want the town to provide status quo or maybe a little bit less. And so having the choice to be able to vote on that rather than, okay, do we just want to vote for an override, continue the same financial plan, the same steady increases that we've had, or do we have another choice? I'm advocating for that other choice.
But in order for us to reflect both the choice you want and the choice I want, we have to have a mechanism to say, do you want more services? So let me give you a stark example of this. We have a movement afoot to reduce the growth rate for the schools, to go from 3.5% to 3.25% and then to 3%. And I sit on the board of the Arlington Education Foundation. We raise money to provide grants to the schools, to individual teachers, to the schools overall, and to particular schools for big school improvement projects, all of which is premised on the idea that all the money we're investing is in innovative practices that will then be scaled up. I just did a review of 13 requests for funding from teachers for really cool, innovative projects, okay? And my assessment, I asked 5 questions to assess on that as a member of the board, and one of those questions is, will this be a good long-term investment for the schools? On every one of my reviews, I wrote, yes, if the school can invest enough money to scale it up. But at 3% growth, they can't. So I'm taking money from the citizens in Arlington Education Foundation. I'm saying we're going to invest this money in innovations in the schools. We put that money into the budget, and then the schools need a way to scale it up. And your assumption is that they're going to have to make choices. They're going to have to choose between this and that. Well, one of those grants, for example, at the moment, let me finish. One of those grants is to add a class in archaeology at the high school. Okay? And so they're going to have the money to pay a teacher and buy materials that we're not going to fund year over year in AEF to add that class to the mix. By the method you're suggesting, they're going to have to choose between that class and some other class that they're now offering.
And are you saying that that's okay, in fact,
No,
that that's the kind of thing?
Okay. If the school department exists in a vacuum, which it doesn't, it's part of the town, it's part of the spending. If the town overall wants to allocate more resources to education because of advocates, strong advocates like you and others, then that's to be politically decided. And so the school's getting whatever 60 million or whatever. That's not a fixed number. That's negotiated amongst the town. And so I'm just going to get back to my point that there's room to negotiate with these resources. And so I would want to keep the resources at the level they're at, or any additional resources. I want to come. I'm willing as a taxpayer if it makes sense. But I also want the town to be looking at itself to be finding, is it allocating its resources as well as it can?
Right, but it leads back to the question of what do you want to cut? What do you not want to do anymore? And as a taxpayer, as much as I'm going to advocate for that we increase spending for the schools, that we not go from 3.5% to 3%, and I'm prepared to do battle on that, I feel very strongly about it. I understand that the implication is that either we're going to have an override sooner than we're currently projecting, and we're going to go to the taxpayers and ask them to fund that increase in spending, or we're going to have to cut something in the town department. I don't want to cut anything. I'm not the one advocating for that. I'm asking you again, if you want that class in archaeology at the high school and you don't want it to come at the cost of some reduction in education services in some other area of that budget, what budget do you want to cut? What service you're getting do you not want to get anymore? And if you need some help, I'm willing to go into the book and find some examples.
Am I wrong in thinking that what you are saying, Walter, in a sense, is that you want departments to have to do that self-reflection of, here's an opportunity to introduce an archaeology course, but if so, we're going to have to let something else go. So there's going to have to be a trade-off there in a sense. Is that not what you're advocating on? I'm not talking about with this.
There might have to be a trade-off. There might have to be a trade-off. There might not. I mean, the town's already, the income is already increasing 2.5% every year just by fiat, right? And whether or not there's other income that the town receives, then that's a bonus. So there's. I mean, I don't know the education budget well enough to say, okay, it's 50 million, and what are they spending that money on? Obviously, it's mostly payroll, but they have. This is where I would defer to the managers, the professionals, the professional managers, to say, okay, if the school wants to have an archaeology department, and on balance, that's what the town wants to have, then let's look at either what resources do we have within the town that we can utilize to fund that, and at the same time, if we want to ask the citizens for more money, fine. But what I see is it's asking the citizens for more money. That's what I see, and I see the amount of spending just continuing to rise and rise, and it's frustrating. They're just always, okay, we're going to pay more this year. We're going to pay more this year.
Well, I just was wondering, what do you think? Listening to the two of you, I'm struck by one datum. We acknowledge that 80% of the town's budget is going to pay personnel.
Yep.
We all know, as employees ourselves, that we are always hoping and expecting on some level, if we've performed our jobs properly, that there will be a raise at the end of the year. Is that not, by definition, going to increase the amount of money that a town has to spend when 80% of its expenses are going up every year, simply to pay I'm sure mostly modest raise to most or all of the employees.
That's a great flashpoint, James, and that is the difference between employment in the public sector and employment in private industry. And there's big differences, and there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Does somebody who's working in the public sector, well, I'll tell you what I think about it from my perspective. In the public sector, you got pretty good job security. If you work there long enough, you get an excellent pension. And so you're exchanging your services and your labor for some of that security. Now, whether or not that means, and compare that to somebody in private industry, they have a little bit less job security. Their company could go down, they could not perform efficiently, you know, and so they don't have as much job security. They don't have as much of an opportunity for a pension necessarily, or it's that's true. So the public sector employee, should they be looking for a raise in the same way that a private sector employee would be looking for a raise for the relative improvement in their efficiency? Good question. I would advocate there's got to be some difference there.
I've worked in the private sector my entire life. My husband has worked in the private sector his entire life. My father's worked in the private sector his entire life. None of us know anybody who does not get a raise every year. If your company, yes. Maybe in a year when there's a big crisis at a company, I never had a year, and I work totally for nonprofits. I never had a year.
What happens is people lose their jobs more often. And you know,
sure, when we can't afford our employees, we have to cut jobs too.
Right.
Okay? So that job
agree,
security.
It happens much less frequently in government. And if you look at since the last time we had to reduce our staff by 50 or whatever it was,
right.
the total payroll has been increasing. The total amount of employees has been increasing.
Very, very slightly.
Right.
Very slightly. I think we've added, overall in the whole system, we've added 9 employees in the last 5 years.
I know many government workers. I love government workers. And it's a different dynamic with when you're working in the public sector. You have different rewards. You have different trade-offs. You don't think it's different between being a public sector and
my husband works in
what
is nominally a private sector job. He does research in artificial intelligence. He not only gets a raise every year, but he gets a bonus for all of the money he brings into the company. All of that money comes from the Defense Department. All of that money is your federal tax dollars. Your federal tax dollars pay for his benefits, his vacation, etc. Absolutely, it's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's the Defense Department, and there is absolutely nobody. There is nobody in the federal government who is advocating to tighten those rules for that kind of private contracting for the federal government.
That sometimes the systemic change has to start from the ground floor. The federal government is not the ground floor. Local government is the ground floor. It goes from the local to the state to the country.
I understand. We could divorce ourselves entirely from federal and state funding if we wanted to raise our taxes enough to pay for those services ourselves. We'd still be having the same debate.
I'm not advocating that.
I understand, but we would still be having the same debate. We would still be every year having to look at can we pay the same or less and get the same services? And every year the answer is going to be no. The cost of electricity goes up. The cost of food goes up. Our employees can't go forever without getting a raise.
You have a holy grail, which is the same level of services.
Absolutely. I don't have a holy grail that's the same level of services. I have a holy grail that says that we need to start thinking about the services that we are not providing. Okay, I was very pleased to see when I went through the budget book this year that Fred Ryan has somehow pulled together the resources
to manage.
Police
Chief Fred
That's
Ryan.
the police chief, Fred Ryan, has pulled together the resources to put back together his traffic unit, which was cut in, I forget whether it was 2003 or 2008, but in one of the reductions that we underwent in staff waiting to pass another override, we disbanded the traffic unit. That's a set of people who are of his officers who are dedicated to doing nothing but traffic patrol. We just had another fatality on Mass Avenue in East Arlington. The traffic unit is about slowing down traffic on Mass Ave so we don't have fatalities. We're not investing in little things that are nice to haves, when we make those investments, we're investing in services people need. When I first got on the Board of Selectmen, we could not afford to have a detective do 24-hour surveillance on a property if we needed to in order to detect a crime. We had, over the course of the time that I was on the Board of Selectmen, I want to say we busted drug operations in Arlington 2 or 3 times and prostitution rings at least twice. That's why you need a detective to be able to do 24-hour surveillance. We need to be able to support those services. Unless you are on the inside of all of this, you don't quite understand exactly how close to the edge we skate. We've had 2 microbursts in East Arlington in the last few years that downed trees all over the place, branches, so on and so forth. We're lucky that we had no loss of life in both of those microbursts. We have 3 guys on staff who are responsible for maintaining the health and managing the removal of unhealthy trees amongst our street trees. We have 18,000 street trees.
So,
Okay.
you bring up some great points. There's a lot of needs. There's a lot of opportunity to provide services. A microburst is something that occasionally happens. What I'm arguing for is that by more conservative management of our resources, we have more resource to attend to specific issues that happen from
Right,
time to time in the
but
town. We
again-
don't have to be, handling the microbursts is a small point, if I may, compared to what the override vote question is going to be 1, 2, 5 years from now.
Absolutely, I understand. But some of that damage might have been avoided if we had one more guy on the tree crew and we had somebody who could proactively go around town and look for unhealthy trees. Right now, we're in a condition where, as far as I know, at least this was true 2 years ago when I was still on the board, we wait for somebody to call. And we only deal with reported problems reported by the citizens that say, hey, the tree across the street from me next to the school's not looking very healthy.
Well,
Okay? They don't have the time to go around and do that proactive management.
We do have the resource to reconstruct, rebuild, renew a lot of our resources around town. And I would argue that to a certain extent, that we kind of go, in a certain sense, bear with me, we create monuments in this town. We redo a firehouse or we redo a school, and it's very nice, and it costs a ton of money. And so, have we done those as efficiently? Have we allocated our capital planning resources, the whole bit, to the point where that's our most efficient, effective use of that resource, so that we have more resources to pay our patrolmen, to pay our tree guys, to pay our school teachers?
We did a data study on all of the fire calls and emergency medical calls throughout the town and which fire stations responded and how quickly they were able to respond before we rebuilt 3 fire stations. What we discovered is that the Park Avenue station is the station that can respond the most quickly to East Arlington because of their location. Okay, we rebuilt those 3 fire stations because we can't cover the town to the National
I'm not saying
Fire.
that we shouldn't
Let me
have
finish.
rebuilt them.
We can't cover the town to the National Fire Protection Association standards if we don't have all 3 of those fire stations. We absolutely look at whether or not we need those. We had a big debate in this town before we passed the first override to rebuild 7 schools about whether or not we wanted larger elementary schools and fewer of them. And this community supported the idea of 7 elementary schools and all the advantages that a smaller school building has for kids at that age. Every single one of our school buildings, despite our rebuilding program, and perhaps because of our rebuilding program, is overcrowded despite all of that rebuilding. We went from 17% of the population of Arlington having kids in the public schools to 28% of the population of Arlington having kids in the public schools. People move here for our schools. They want us to continue to invest in those schools. Again, the frame that everybody has gotten used to is this frame that says, if we just keep looking at it harder, somehow we will find a way to make government more efficient and to cost less. And there is a limit to that. And at least
But
as
I
far...
don't think we reached it.
How could we not have reached it? We have restricted the rate at which our income can grow. We don't go up willy-nilly based on everybody's dream services. We go up only at the rate of growth. And for our property taxes, that's 2.5%. Our state aid does not grow at that rate, and in fact, frequently gets reset well below that.
Let me ask a question, pose a question. Again, back to the 80% of the budget going to personnel. Would you be arguing, Annie, that the current personnel costs are in fact the most efficient use of those resources, or are there in fact ways in which the town could be more vigilant, better monitor what productivity it is getting from the various personnel, such that there could be some savings to be had or a redistribution of some of those costs to be able to provide other kinds of services?
So here's the debate that I don't think we ever have, and it's a very difficult debate to have, and it requires, if citizens are going to be involved in it, it would require them understanding a lot of things that I'm not sure they all understand. The debate we never have is, what are the services that we want, and how do we measure whether or not those services are effective? How do you measure the effectiveness of our police force? Okay? Nobody's dead. The rate at which our houses are broken into is very small. Our kids are basically safe.
Everybody kind of makes their own decision.
Exactly.
I feel safe in this community.
Exactly. So there's your metric. We feel safe in this community. But we don't know at what point, if we keep reducing services in the police department in order to, I don't know, not have the rate of growth that you object to in this budget, we don't know at what point we cross the line and now we're not safe. Because nobody knows what the real metrics are. And that's true department after department after department. So I would love it if we had a way to measure the efficiency of all these employees, but it depends on your definition of efficiency. There's also a difference, let me finish. There's a difference between effectiveness and efficiency. So is our police force effective? Yeah, our police force is effective. What do you want to do to ensure that they, I don't know, are more effective? Cutting is not always the answer to being more efficient or more effective.
I'm not talking about cutting. I'm talking about what the financial plan projects as additional costs in the future. I'm saying I would like to have a choice as a taxpayer between, do I support a $10 million override, or would I be willing to support an override of a lesser amount? And if I supported that override, then that would mean that this, that, and the other thing would be adjusted, cut out, whatever, however you want to call it, reallocated of resources. So I think a choice is good. And so that's what I'm advocating for. I'm not advocating for cutting town staff right now. Absolutely not. I think every citizen makes their decision on, do I feel safe? Do I feel like the school did a good job educating our kids? Are the parks in good shape? We all make those decisions, and then we go out and we vote for the people we think will advocate for them the best. Or if we think, if we're interested in the school, then maybe we'll find a way to participate in the schools. And so, tough job to kind of congeal all those opinions and all that information down into, our school system is awesome. And, it's like people have different opinions. And so what I'm advocating for is a shared responsibility for how we go forward.
But it does sound like what you were just saying regarding the override, for instance, might be addressed by what Annie described before as a menu override or menu referendum, where you're laying out for the citizens, here's what happens if you vote for the 10 million. Here's what happens if you vote for 8 million. Here's what happens if you, et cetera, and laying out a number of different choices. Is that what you're getting at?
That might be a way to measure, Annie, for example, like if people's sense is that the school department is doing a really good job, or the police are doing a really good job, that might be a way for them to vote on where they think the resources need to go. And so it would be a menu of, as a governing body, we feel like, okay, we need a little more resource over here in this part of the 140 million. And so give us the opportunity to vote and hear what the citizens have to say about it. Is what the town government thinks is the best way to go? Is that where the citizens want the town government to go?
I absolutely agree. But on that menu then, there have to be the addition of services that some of us believe are missing.
Bring it on.
Okay.
Put it on there.
So you could
Absolutely.
have a 12 million option or something like that, where
Right,
you're
you
saying,
could have an
here's
option
what
to
more, even
add
more can
services.
provide.
I feel a new committee
Okay.
coming up.
Oh, no.
Well, so certainly, Walter, you have well expressed your disquiet as a taxpayer with the fact that the burden seems to be going up all the time and seems to be, in your from your perspective, mostly on the taxpayer. And you have certainly very well argued for the fact that we're already operating efficiently and we have a lot of mechanisms in place, including the financial plan and its constraints. All of that gets us back, in my opinion, to a question that we have touched on in previous conversations, but I just wanted to bring out again, and that is, why are we not making more concerted efforts as a town, to increase the commercial tax base within the town, which could therefore not have to diminish the pie that we're talking about, but lower the tax burden on property holders.
There's a really technical answer to that question. Okay, so the first answer to that question is that the only way that increasing the commercial base in town reduces or limits, helps to keep a cap on the growth in residential property taxes is if we have enough of a commercial base to have a split tax rate, to charge our businesses more than we do our residents. Right now, something like 97% of the property in town is residential and 3% is commercial. In order to get to the point where you have the ability to have a split tax rate, we'd have to have 25% of the town occupied by commercial enterprises. That is a huge shift in
That sounds actually
development.
just impossible.
It's not doable.
Absolutely
It's not doable.
impossible.
So we're never going to have a growth in commercial properties in the town that increases that puts us to where we can have a split tax rate. And so as much as people say that that's what they want to do, I don't think they actually understand the necessity of that. Okay. The other thing that comes up is the question of new growth, and it's the same thing. We can have more new growth, and we can grow our tax base by adding properties that are taxable. But what that means is allowing for much more density and taller buildings and so on and so forth. And our zoning bylaw does not allow for that. We'd have to make major changes to the zoning bylaw, and we'd have to build some community consensus around that. And my sense is that as much as I love Manhattan, and I'd love to see mini Manhattan in Arlington, most people in Arlington don't live here because they want it to be Manhattan-like.
Right.
They like the town,
Being
level of density that it
essentially-
is, and being essentially suburban in quality and so on and so forth.
And that brings it back to where the governors of our town have a limited set of resources that they have to work with. You can always ask for more, and the people can vote that up or down. But it is a limited set of resources. We're a town. Being that we're so residential, that's an advantage to a certain extent. We don't have a lot of commerce.
Right.
We don't have these big buildings. We don't have a lot of cars coming into Arlington. I think.
Got a lot going through, but not coming in.
That's our little fiefdom, right? And so we have to operate within that as best we can.
Yep. And I would say that there's another method that we could use, Walter, that might get at the differences between you and I, and that's what's called zero-basing the budget, which means that you literally start from nothing and you start adding back, okay, is this an important service? Do we want this? Do we want it at this level? And you add that into the budget until you get, and it allows you to see those areas where maybe you're providing services that are not necessarily essential. And I would be up for zero-basing the budget as long as we consider the possibility that there are things that we are not doing that we ought to be doing.
But when you say, as part of that, that it would be that you'd be asking the question, is this an important service, et cetera? Do we value it at this, at this rate? Who is answering that question?
Well, that is the problem, is that, again, if all of the services the town of Arlington provides, this is all about what do the taxpayers want, okay? And if you have extensive conversations with taxpayers all over town, you will hear them say, I want this, I want this, I want this. Often, I don't know of a constituent I ever talked to who didn't want to add something to the budget.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And when you say to them, okay, what do you want to cut? They're like, well, I don't know, that's your job. And my answer is, I can't do that based on what I want to do. It would be easy for me to cut $5 million out of this budget. There's a lot of people in town who'd be very unhappy about that because the first thing I'd do is cut trash collection. Privatize it.
Sure.
Get it out of the budget.
So,
there's your $5 million. But I know my constituents don't want to do that. Okay? Or my former constituents, I should be careful here.
Your neighbors.
Yeah, my neighbors don't want to do that. So often the problem is that the feedback loop is not good. And in fact, overrides are the only feedback loop we have. We need to build a new feedback loop if you want to do what you're talking about doing. Okay?
Yeah, yes, because it sounds like what your conversations with neighbors reflect is that just like you were saying about entities, be they private, public, et cetera, wanting to grow, most people can identify where they want services to grow without being able to identify.
And if you took,
where they'd be
you
willing
took
to cut.
every concerned citizen, and even ones that are unconcerned, and that you said, what would you like to have? We'd have a $300 million budget.
Yep.
Right? And so you've got, but that's not, that hasn't shown itself in the political will of the town to tax itself in such a way to support that level. So here's the level that we have. You know, it's all fine and good.
But
how do we go forward from here? Giving as much voice to everybody to say, okay, yes, I want to support the town's growth at this level, or I want to support it at this level.
Right. But I would argue that we've never actually asked the question of whether or not the town would want to support the budget that would make everybody's wishes and dreams come true. We've never asked. Now, I'm not saying we should, because I do think that would be an unreasonable level of taxation.
Everybody would say yes.
But maybe. Okay,
You mean everybody would say
No,
yes to the
that's not
services,
true.
they might not say yes to the price.
Exactly.
I would vote against that.
Exactly. And frankly, I'd vote against it because there'd be wishes and dreams in there that I don't want to support. Trust me. I think that we have some pretty good control mechanisms. And I think that when you talk about the idea that government wants to grow, what you're not recognizing is that often that government wants to grow not in response to its own internal desire to be bigger. Okay? We don't, just sort of say, oh, okay, we'll give everybody 5% raise this year and they'll do the same services and so on. There's no pressure from the town manager or any of the management staff to, go crazy here.
So maybe.
Okay, let me finish though. But, there is a lot of citizen pressure to do more.
Right.
There's a lot of citizen pressure to plow the sidewalks. There's a lot of citizen pressure to reduce class sizes. There's all kinds of things that the citizens will tell you that they want.
And that's what government officials are
And government
hearing.
officials are responding to
Absolutely.
that. They're not
Absolutely.
responding to internal pressure to self-centeredly grow.
That's
So
an arguable point.
It's not fair to ask the employees to share the pain when what the pain is brought on by is our desire for more services without our taxes going up.
Right.
So as long as we're all clear about that, I'm good with a more citizen engagement around the budget and budget priorities.
I think that's absolutely true that a government employee will respond to what they see as a need that is being voiced by the people that are paying their salary.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's legitimate. At the same time, as any good employee, you want to look, what else can I do out here? What else? Where else can we have a positive impact potentially? And that's where I'm saying that I want to have my voice heard on what whether it's a government employee or a department or a committee, what they think is a good way. We all have our most favorite sacred cows that we want to fund. And so that by having choice as a voter, I think having more than a simple up or no vote is something that I welcome.
And on that note, messy, complicated, the conversation has covered a lot of ground, as does the budget. We will continue to wrestle with these kinds of issues, again, against the backdrop that we all agree that things are going pretty well here in Arlington, and we are happy as residents and citizens, though there are plenty of points still to be debated. Stay tuned for future episodes of Your Arlington Dollar. For Walter Fye and Annie LaCourt, I'm James Milan for Arlington Public News. Thanks for joining us today.